June 19, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Admiral Ozawa stands on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Taiho, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he peers through his binoculars at the distant horizon. What he sees there will haunt him for the rest of his life. Stretching across the ocean as far as the eye can see, a forest of masts and superstructures rises from the water like steel mountains. American aircraft carriers, dozens of them, their flight decks bristling with hundreds of warplanes. Task Force 58, the largest carrier force ever assembled in human history. Behind Ozawa, his staff officers whisper in stunned disbelief. These are not the same ships they fought at Pearl Harbor. These are newer, larger, more powerful than anything Japan has ever built. The rising sun illuminates the American fleet, and in that moment, Ozawa understands with crystalline clarity what many of his colleagues refuse to accept. Japan cannot win this war. The floating air bases before him represent something beyond military might. They represent the industrial soul of America itself, awakened from its peaceful slumber and transformed into an engine of war that Japan simply cannot match. 3 years earlier, the world looked very different. December 7, 1941, had dawned with Japanese confidence at its peak. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 6 aircraft carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision, sinking or damaging 18 American warships and killing over 2,400 Americans in a single morning. Japanese naval aviators, among the most experienced and skilled in the world, had executed what many considered the most audacious naval attack in history. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day 1941. Singapore, Britain's supposed deadly impregnable fortress, surrendered in February 1942 after just 1 week of fighting. The Dutch East Indies, with its precious oil reserves, capitulated in March. General Douglas MacArthur abandoned the Philippines, promising to return. Japanese admirals spoke confidently of dictating peace terms in Washington itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific with 10 aircraft carriers, each crewed by veteran pilots who had honed their skills in the skies over China since 1937. These men were not mere soldiers. They were samurai of the air, trained from childhood in the warrior traditions of Bushido. Their Zero fighters dominated every engagement. Their torpedo bombers and dive bombers struck with surgical precision. American naval power lay in ruins at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. But even in those heady days of victory, a few Japanese leaders harbored deep concerns. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood America in ways his colleagues did not. In private conversations, he warned that Japan had perhaps 6 months to achieve decisive victory before American industrial might would overwhelm them completely. Yamamoto had seen Detroit's automobile factories, Pittsburgh's steel mills, the vast oil refineries of Texas. He knew that America possessed something Japan could never match, an industrial base 10 times larger than Japan's, protected by 2 great oceans and blessed with seemingly unlimited natural resources. The attack on Pearl Harbor, he feared, had not crippled America, but merely awakened a sleeping giant. His fears were well-founded. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin Roosevelt was on the telephone with automobile executives across America. Henry Ford, who had built an empire on mass production, immediately offered his factories to the war effort. General Motors followed suit, then Chrysler. Assembly lines that had produced Buicks and Chevrolets would soon be turning out aircraft engines and tank turrets. But it was in the shipyards where America's response would prove most decisive. Even before Pearl Harbor, Congress had authorized a massive naval expansion program. Now, with war declared, that program shifted into overdrive. The Essex-class aircraft carrier program, designed to replace the losses at Pearl Harbor, became the largest single naval construction project in human history. By mid-1942, American shipyards from Newport News to San Francisco Bay rang with the sound of riveting guns and welding torches 24 hours a day. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was already taking shape on the ways at Newport News shipbuilding. Her sisters would follow at an unprecedented pace. one new fleet carrier every 2 months, each capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to replace their losses from the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where they had lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and many of their most experienced pilots in a single day. While Japanese shipyards labored to replace their Midway losses, American industrial capacity exploded into action with a fury that defied comprehension. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before the war, revolutionized naval construction with techniques borrowed from highway building. His Richmond shipyard in California became a symbol of American industrial might, launching a new Liberty ship every 10 days, a pace that seemed impossible until it became routine. Kaiser's methods were revolutionary. Instead of building ships from the keel up in traditional fashion, his yards prefabricated entire sections in massive assembly halls, then moved them to the ways for final assembly. Welding replaced riveting. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, earning the nickname Rosie the Riveter, as they proved every bit as capable as their male counterparts. The famous photograph of a Liberty ship launched just 4 days and 15 hours after its keel was laid became a symbol of American determination. But Liberty ships were just the beginning. The Essex-class carriers represented a quantum leap in naval engineering and mass production. Each carrier displaced 27,000 tons and stretched nearly 900 feet from bow to stern, longer than 3 football fields. Their flight decks could accommodate up to 100 aircraft, double the capacity of Japan's largest carriers. More importantly, they could be built faster than Japan could sink them. Newport News Shipbuilding led the Essex program, but yards across America joined the effort. New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn, Philadelphia. Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Each became a hive of round-the-clock activity. Steel flowed from Pittsburgh's mills, aluminum from Alcoa's factories, electronics from General Electric and Westinghouse. The entire American economy reorganized itself around a single goal: victory at sea. The numbers told the story of American industrial supremacy. In 1942, American shipyards launched 8 million tons of naval vessels. Japan managed barely 600,000 tons. By 1943, the gap had widened to an impossible chasm. America was building carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to oppose them. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex, commissioned in December 1942. Her sister Yorktown followed in April 1943, then Intrepid. In August, Hornet in November. Each new carrier brought not just steel and aircraft, but something even more precious: experienced American pilots trained in the vast skies over Texas, Florida, and California. The United States had solved the pilot training bottleneck that crippled Japan by creating a pipeline of aviators that seemed inexhaustible. Flight schools operated at Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and dozens of other locations, graduating hundreds of new pilots each month. Japan, by contrast, struggled with critical shortages of everything from aviation fuel to experienced instructors. The veterans who had swept across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 were irreplaceable once lost. Japanese pilot training programs, based on elite selection and years of intensive preparation, could not adapt to the demands of total war. Where America trained pilots for 6 months and sent them to combat with hundreds of hours of flying time, Japan was forced to send barely trained teenagers into battle after just a few weeks of instruction. The strategic implications became clear to perceptive Japanese officers by early 1944. Admiral Ozawa, newly appointed commander of the mobile fleet, received intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture. American task forces now routinely operated with 12 to 15 fleet carriers, supported by dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Each task force carried more aircraft than the entire Japanese Navy had possessed at the start of the war. By June 1944, Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher had grown into the most powerful naval force in history: 15 fleet carriers, supported by nearly 1,000 aircraft and a screen of modern battleships and cruisers. Against this armada, Ozawa could muster just 9 carriers, many of them converted from other ship types, carrying fewer than 500 aircraft total. The mathematics of naval warfare had shifted decisively against Japan and T-Sun. Floating airbases gathering on the horizon of the Philippine Sea represented the full flowering of American industrial might. From the human perspective, the realization dawned gradually on Japanese naval leadership like a slow-breaking fever. Admiral Ozawa himself embodied this tragic awareness. A brilliant tactician who had graduated at the top of his Naval Academy class, Ozawa possessed the rare combination of strategic vision and honest self-assessment that made him beloved even by his American opponents. Unlike many of his peers, he refused to let pride cloud his judgment of Japan's deteriorating position. In private conversations with his staff throughout early 1944, Ozawa spoke with brutal honesty about Japan's chances. Intelligence reports crossing his desk painted an increasingly grim picture. Each month brought news of more American carriers joining the Pacific Fleet. The USS Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Franklin, names that would become legendary in American naval history, but which struck fear into Japanese hearts. These were not hastily converted merchant ships or improvised designs, but purpose-built instruments of war, each more capable than Japan's finest carriers. The human cost of this realization weighed heavily on officers who had dedicated their lives to the Imperial Navy. Captain Toshikazu Ome, one of Japan's most experienced carrier aviation officers, later wrote of the crushing spiritual burden that settled over the combined fleet as reports of American industrial capacity reached them. Men who had once spoken confidently of victory now privately counseled their sons to prepare for defeat. Tactically, the shift in carrier warfare doctrine reflected America's industrial advantages in ways that Japanese strategists found impossible to counter. Early in the war, carrier battles had been fought like medieval duels, small numbers of highly skilled aviators engaging in single combat, where individual expertise mattered more than raw numbers. The Japanese had excelled at this type of warfare, their veteran pilots often shooting down multiple American aircraft in single engagements. But by 1944, American carrier operations had evolved into something entirely different: industrial warfare at sea. Task Force 58 operated like a floating factory of destruction, capable of launching coordinated strikes of 300 or more aircraft against single targets. Individual pilot skill, while still important, mattered less than the sheer weight of numbers and the coordination of massive formations. American pilots might be less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, but they flew newer aircraft, carried better radios, and operated within a system designed for mass production of airstrikes. The leadership angle revealed perhaps the most tragic dimension of Japan's position. Admiral Yamamoto's death in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over the Solomon Islands, had deprived Japan of its most realistic strategic thinker. His successors, while competent tacticians, often fell victim to the wishful thinking that plagued Japanese military planning throughout the war. Admiral Sumu Toyota, who assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death, epitomized this dangerous optimism. Despite overwhelming evidence of American superiority, Toyota continued to plan operations based on assumptions of Japanese tactical superiority that no longer reflected reality. His Operation A-Go, the plan to destroy American carrier forces in a decisive battle near the Mariana Islands, rested on the fantasy that Japanese pilots could achieve kill ratios of 10-1 against American aviators. Even more revealing were the reactions of junior officers who served aboard Japanese carriers during this period. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a dive bomber pilot aboard the carrier Zuikaku, wrote in his diary of the terrible loneliness that settled over Japanese air crews as they prepared for what many understood would be their final battle. Unlike their American counterparts, who rotated home after completing combat tours, Japanese aviators served until death or victory. By 1944, most understood which would come first. The psychological pressure extended beyond individual officers to the entire institutional culture of the Imperial Navy. Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized spiritual strength over material superiority, teaching that superior morale and training could overcome numerical disadvantages. This philosophy had served Japan well in earlier conflicts against China and Russia, but it proved catastrophically inadequate against an enemy that possessed both superior morale and overwhelming material advantages. From the technological angle, the American advantage represented more than mere numbers. It embodied a fundamental revolution in naval engineering and mass production that Japan simply could not match. The Essex-class carriers incorporated lessons learned from 3 years of Pacific combat, featuring improved damage control systems, better armor protection, and flight deck designs optimized for rapid aircraft operations. Each Essex could launch and recover aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible to pre-war naval architects. American technological superiority extended far beyond the ships themselves. The F-6F Hellcat fighters that crowded Essex flight decks represented a quantum leap over earlier American designs. Built by Grumman with lessons learned from captured Zero fighters, the Hellcat combined superior firepower, armor protection, and diving speed with manufacturing techniques that allowed production of over 12,000 aircraft during the war. Where Japan struggled to build a few hundred examples of each fighter type, America mass-produced aircraft like automobiles. The radar systems aboard American carriers gave them eyes that could see far beyond the horizon, detecting Japanese aircraft formations while they were still hundreds of miles away. These electronic marvels, products of American research laboratories at MIT and Bell Labs, provided Task Force 58 with tactical awareness that Japanese commanders could barely comprehend. Admiral Ozawa would launch his strikes blind, hoping to locate American carriers through visual reconnaissance, while American defenders tracked his approach from the moment his aircraft left their decks. From the enemy perspective, American industrial capacity appeared almost supernatural in its scope and speed. Japanese intelligence officers studying captured American documents discovered production figures they initially dismissed as propaganda. The reality that America was completing a new fleet carrier every 60 days seemed impossible until Japanese reconnaissance aircraft began photographing the growing fleets at Pearl Harbor and Ulithi. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, later wrote of his shock upon learning the true extent of American shipbuilding. "We had sunk or damaged 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor," he reflected, and felt we had crippled American naval power. But by 1944, they were operating more battleships in the Pacific than we had ever possessed, and their carrier force was 10 times larger than what we had destroyed. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators proved equally devastating. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, described the growing sense of hopelessness that pervaded Japanese air groups by 1944. "We faced not an enemy, but a machine," he wrote. "Every pilot we shot down was replaced by 2 more. Every carrier we sank was replaced by 3. We were fighting not just America, but American industry itself." Japanese attempts to counter American industrial might through technological innovation often backfired spectacularly. The massive battleship Yamato, with her 18-inch guns and 65,000-ton displacement, represented Japan's attempt to achieve quality through individual superiority. But Yamato consumed resources equivalent to several aircraft carriers, and her construction came at the cost of dozens of smaller vessels that Japan desperately needed for convoy escort and amphibious operations. The moral dimension of this technological imbalance created profound spiritual crises within the Japanese officer corps. The Code of Bushido taught that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantages, but how could spirit triumph when the material disadvantage was 50-1? Some officers, like Admiral Takeo Kurita, began to question whether continuing the war served any honorable purpose when defeat was mathematically certain. American technological advantages extended to pilot training as well. Where Japanese flight schools had been devastated by the need to rush instructors into combat, American training facilities expanded continuously throughout the war. The vast spaces of Texas and Florida provided ideal conditions for pilot training, while American aviation fuel supplies seemed unlimited compared to Japan's dwindling reserves. Perhaps most demoralizing was the realization that American advantages were accelerating rather than diminishing. Each month brought new technological innovations, improved aircraft, better radar, more effective anti-aircraft weapons. American research and development programs, backed by unlimited funding, and the world's most advanced industrial base, generated improvements at a pace that left Japanese engineers scrambling simply to understand what they faced. The floating airbases gathering on the Philippine Sea horizon represented the culmination of this technological revolution. Each Essex-class carrier embodied thousands of innovations, from improved steel alloys to advanced electronics to more efficient propulsion systems. They were products not just of American shipyards, but of an entire industrial ecosystem that Japan could never hope to replicate. In the face of such overwhelming technological superiority, even the most devoted Japanese officers began to understand that courage alone could not secure victory. At 05:45 hours on June 19, 1944, the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance as Admiral Ozawa gave the order that would seal Japan's naval doom. "Launch aircraft for attack on enemy carriers," he commanded from Taiho's bridge, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. This was Operation Ago, Japan's last desperate gamble to destroy American carrier power in a single decisive engagement. The morning air filled with the thunder of aircraft engines as Japanese carriers across the mobile fleet began launching their strikes. From Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, rose formations of bombers and fighters. From the smaller carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Ryuho came additional squadrons. In total, 373 Japanese aircraft climbed into the dawn sky, representing virtually every flyable plane in the Japanese fleet. But these were the veteran aviators who had swept across the Pacific in 1941. Most of Ozawa's pilots had fewer than 6 months of training, rushed into combat as Japan desperately tried to replace the irreplaceable veterans lost at Midway, Guadalcanal, and dozens of other battles. Many had never landed on a carrier at night. Some had never fired their guns in anger. They were teenagers, really, sent to face the most experienced and well-equipped naval aviation force in history. 60 miles to the east, Admiral Mark Mitcher aboard USS Lexington was already tracking the Japanese approach. Task Force 58's radar screens painted a clear picture of the incoming threat. Massive formations of aircraft approaching from the west in 4 distinct waves. Unlike previous Pacific battles where surprise had been crucial, this engagement would be fought in broad daylight with both sides fully aware of the other's position and strength. The numbers told the story of America's transformation since Pearl Harbor. Mitcher commanded 15 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers, embarking over 900 aircraft. Supporting them were 7 fast battleships, including Iowa and New Jersey, with their radar-controlled 16-inch guns, plus 21 cruisers and 69 destroyers. It was the largest naval force ever assembled, representing industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. As the first Japanese strike approached, American fighter directors aboard the carriers began vectoring interceptors toward the threat. F-6F Hellcats rose from multiple carrier decks simultaneously, their powerful Pratt Whitney engines carrying them rapidly to altitude. Unlike the desperate scrambles of 1942, this was coordinated defense on an industrial scale, over 300 American fighters rising to meet the Japanese attackers. The contrast between the opposing forces became apparent immediately. American pilots flew newer aircraft equipped with superior radios, allowing unprecedented coordination between formations. Their Hellcats carried 6 50-caliber machine guns with 20,400 rounds of ammunition, firepower that could destroy most Japanese aircraft with short bursts. The Americans also possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, allowing them to attack Japanese formations from multiple directions simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading a squadron of Hellcats from USS Essex, later described the engagement. "It was like nothing we had seen before. The Japanese came at us in formation, but they seemed confused, uncertain. Their movements lacked the precision we had encountered earlier in the war. We could tell immediately that these were not the veteran pilots we had faced at Guadalcanal." The first Japanese strike wave, consisting of 69 aircraft, met the American fighter screen at 10:36 hours. What followed was less a battle than a systematic destruction. American Hellcats, operating in coordinated divisions, tore through the Japanese formations like wolves among sheep. The superior training, aircraft, and numerical advantage combined to create a slaughter that shocked even experienced American pilots. Within 30 minutes, 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave had been destroyed. Only a handful of bombers managed to reach the American task force, and their attacks achieved minimal results. One bomb hit on the battleship South Dakota caused minor damage. The cost to Japan was catastrophic. experienced air crew that could never be replaced, aircraft that could not be quickly reproduced, and the psychological impact of watching entire squadrons disappear. But this was only the beginning. As the survivors of the first Japanese strike limped back toward their car, EAR's radar operators aboard American ships detected the approach of the second wave. 128 aircraft launched from Japanese carriers, still believing they could achieve decisive victory through superior spirit and tactics. The second Japanese strike wave approached at 1107 hours, and with it came the moment that would forever change the balance of power in the Pacific. Commander David McCampbell, leading fighters from USS Essex, watched through his cockpit canopy as the largest formation of Japanese aircraft he had ever seen filled the sky ahead. But instead of the disciplined formations of veteran aviators that had terrorized the Pacific in 1942, he saw something that filled him with both awe and pity. Boys flying to their deaths with courage that could not compensate for inadequate training and obsolete aircraft. The engagement that followed earned its nickname from American pilots themselves, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Like hunters picking off wild turkeys, experienced American aviators systematically destroyed Japanese aircraft that seemed unable to mount effective resistance. The mathematical superiority of American forces had reached a tipping point where individual heroism became meaningless against industrial warfare. Lieutenant J.G. Alexander Vrechu, flying from USS Intrepid, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, a feat that would have been remarkable in any previous naval battle, but became almost routine during the Philippine Sea engagement. His wing cameras recorded the destruction of Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo planes, whose pilots seemed incapable of executing the evasive maneuvers that might have saved their lives. But the true climax came not in the air, but beneath the waves. At 0909 hours, as the aerial battle raged overhead, USS Albacore's periscope broke the surface 19,000 yards from the Japanese flagship Taiho. Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard studied the massive carrier through his attack periscope, recognizing her as the newest and most powerful ship in the Japanese fleet. The irony was profound. Taiho represented Japan's attempt to match American carrier technology, but she was about to become a victim of American submarine warfare. Blanchard fired 6 torpedoes at 0932 hours. Only one struck home, hitting Taiho's starboard side near the forward gasoline storage compartment. The explosion seemed minor. Taiho continued flight operations, and Admiral Ozawa remained aboard, directing the battle. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation gasoline lines, filling the ship's interior spaces with volatile fumes. Japanese damage control, unlike American procedures developed through hard experience, failed to properly ventilate the contaminated areas. 6 hours later, at 15 and 32 hours, a single spark ignited the accumulated gasoline vapors. The explosion that followed virtually disintegrated Taiho, taking Admiral Ozawa's flagship and 1,650 men to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Ozawa himself survived only because his staff forcibly transferred him to a destroyer against his wishes. The admiral had intended to go down with his ship in accordance with Japanese naval tradition. Almost simultaneously, USS Kavala found another target. At 11:20 hours, Commander Herman Kostler fired 4 torpedoes at the veteran carrier Shokaku, one of only 2 Japanese carriers that had participated in both the Pearl Harbor attack and the Battle of the Coral Sea. 3 torpedoes struck home, and within 3 hours, Shokaku, the most experienced carrier in the Japanese fleet, had joined Taiho on the ocean floes. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese personnel was devastating. Captain Toshikazu Omai, observing from a nearby cruiser, later wrote, "In a single day, we lost not just 2 carriers and 400 aircraft, but the foundation of our naval aviation. The Americans had not merely defeated us, they had demonstrated that our entire approach to naval warfare was obsolete." The third and fourth Japanese strike waves, totaling 82 and 73 aircraft respectively, suffered similar fates. American fighters, now operating with complete tactical superiority, destroyed Japanese formations almost at will. By the end of June 19th, Japan had lost nearly 400 carrier aircraft and their irreplaceable crews, while American losses totaled just 29 aircraft and 22 men. That evening, as Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Haguro, he made a decision that marked the end of Japanese offensive naval operations. Rather than continue the battle with his remaining carriers, he ordered a withdrawal. The mobile fleet, Japan's last hope for achieving naval victory, began its retreat westward, leaving the Mariana Islands to their fate. The human dimension of this defeat resonated far beyond mere numbers. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, later reflected on June 19, 1944. We realized that we were no longer fighting the American Navy we had attacked at Pearl Harbor. We were fighting American industry itself, and American industry was winning. The floating airbases that had appeared on the horizon that morning represented not just superior numbers, but a completely different approach to warfare. One that Japan, with its limited industrial base and traditional military culture, could never hope to match. As darkness fell over the Philippine Sea, the strategic situation in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted. Japan's carrier aviation had been effectively destroyed as an offensive force, while American naval power continued to grow with each passing month. The mathematical certainty of defeat, long understood by perceptive Japanese officers, had finally become operational reality. The morning of June 20, 1944, dawned on a transformed Pacific war. Admiral Ozawa, now aboard the cruiser Haguro after losing his flagship, surveyed the wreckage of what had once been Japan's premier naval force. Of the 9 carriers that had entered battle 2 days earlier, 3 were at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Worse still, Japan had lost the irreplaceable core of its naval aviation, over 450 aircraft and their crews, representing nearly 2 years of desperate pilot training efforts. The immediate tactical consequences were devastating, but the strategic implications proved even more catastrophic. With Japanese carrier aviation effectively destroyed, American amphibious forces could operate with virtual impunity throughout the Central Pacific. The invasion of Saipan, which had prompted Japan's desperate counterattack, proceeded without significant air opposition. Within weeks, American forces would capture airfields within bombing range of the Japanese home islands themselves. Admiral Ozawa's personal response to the defeat reflected the broader psychological trauma afflicting the Imperial Navy. In a series of private communications with Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, Ozawa wrote with brutal honesty about Japan's position. "The enemy possesses strength beyond our capacity to comprehend or counter. We are not fighting a nation, but an industrial colossus that grows stronger with each passing day." These intercepts, analyzed by American naval intelligence, revealed the depth of Japanese despair. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, one of Japan's most experienced carrier aviation officers, reported to his superiors that rebuilding Japanese naval air power would require resources we simply do not possess and time the enemy will not grant us. The mathematics of industrial warfare had become impossible to ignore. America was building carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to oppose them. The human cost extended far beyond the immediate battle casualties. Japanese naval aviation schools, already stretched beyond capacity, received orders to accelerate pilot training even further. Flight instruction that had once taken 2 years was compressed into 6 months, then 4, then 8 weeks. The inevitable result was a death spiral of declining pilot quality that made each subsequent engagement more one-sided than the last. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's highest-scoring surviving ace, witnessed this deterioration firsthand while serving as an instructor at Yokosuka Naval Air Base. "We sent boys into battle," he later wrote, "knowing they would die, not from enemy skill, but from their own inexperience." The Americans, meanwhile, rotated veteran pilots home to train new aviators, preserving their knowledge and experience. We consumed our veterans until none remained. The industrial comparisons the Japanese planners could no longer ignore painted a picture of hopeless disadvantage. American shipyards completed their 15th Essex-class carrier, USS Shangri-La, in September 1944, just 3 months after the Philippine Sea battle. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to repair the damage to its surviving carriers, lacking both skilled shipyard workers and critical materials like high-grade steel and electronics. Even more demoralizing were intelligence reports about American pilot training capabilities. The United States operated over 60 naval flight training facilities by 1944, graduating 1,500 new pilots each month. Japan's entire pilot training establishment, devastated by the need to rush instructors into combat, could barely produce 200 pilots monthly, and most lacked the 300-plus hours of flight time that American pilots received before entering combat. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership proved equally devastating. Admiral Suemu Toyota, who had ordered Operation Eigo with expectations of decisive victory, submitted his resignation to Emperor Hirohito within days of receiving Ozawa's after-action reports. His replacement, Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, privately told his staff that Japan's naval strategy must shift from offensive operations to honorable defeat, a euphemism that fooled no one about the war's inevitable outcome. Perhaps most telling were the reactions of Japanese civilians who learned of the defeat through carefully censored reports. Despite government propaganda claiming victory, the absence of returning pilots and the visible preparations for homeland defense told a different story. Factory workers in Nagoya and Osaka, already struggling with material shortages, understood that the carriers they built were sailing to certain destruction against an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed limitless. The months fall. Owing the Philippine Sea disaster witnessed the complete collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. By October 1944, the Imperial Navy could muster fewer than 100 experienced carrier pilots, a force smaller than what a single American Essex-class carrier embarked. The mathematical impossibility of victory became operational reality as Japanese admirals found themselves commanding fleets without the aircrew to make them effective. Admiral Takeo Kurita, tasked with leading the center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, embodied this tragic situation. His powerful surface fleet, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, sailed without meaningful air cover because no such cover existed. "We advanced like blind men into a storm," he confided to his chief of staff, hoping that courage might substitute for the aircraft we no longer possess. The post-war testimonies of Japanese naval officers, collected by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, revealed the psychological devastation that accompanied military defeat. Admiral Ozawa, interviewed in 1946, spoke with remarkable candor about the moment his service understood the war was lost. "After the Philippine Sea, we possessed the knowledge that defeat was certain. We continued fighting not for victory, but for honor, and perhaps to achieve terms less harsh than unconditional surrender." These interviews, conducted by American intelligence officers, painted a picture of military leadership trapped between mathematical reality and political impossibility. Admiral Suemu Toyota admitted that by late 1944, the combined fleet existed primarily on paper. Most ships lacked fuel for extended operations, trained crews for effective combat, or aircraft for meaningful strikes. "We had become a navy in name only," he reflected, commanded by admirals without ships and pilots without planes. The industrial statistics that emerged after Japan's surrender confirmed what perceptive officers had understood by mid-1944. America completed 24 Essex-class fleet carriers during the war, each carrying 90 to 100 aircraft. Japan, despite desperate efforts, completed only one fleet carrier, Taiho, and one converted liner, Shinano, after Pearl Harbor. The production ratio was approximately 12-1 in America's favor, and even this understated American advantages since Japanese carriers operated with increasingly inexperienced crews and obsolete aircraft. American carrier production continued accelerating even after Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed. USS Antietam, commissioned in January 1945, followed by Shangri-La in September, then Boxer in April 1945. Each new carrier represented industrial capacity that Japan could never match, not just in construction, but in the thousands of trained personnel, hundreds of aircraft, and millions of gallons of aviation fuel required for operations. The human cost of Japan's naval defeat extended far beyond military casualties. Families throughout Japan received the dreaded glorious death notifications as young pilots died in increasingly hopeless missions. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the war's final phase represented not tactical innovation, but admission that conventional naval aviation was no longer possible. When a nation sends its pilots on suicide missions, it acknowledges that victory through traditional means has become impossible. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, spent the war's final months as a staff officer watching Japan's naval capabilities disintegrate. His post-war memoir reflected on the irony of Japanese strategy. We attacked Pearl Harbor to prevent American naval expansion, but succeeded only in accelerating it beyond our worst fears. By 1945, America possessed more aircraft carriers than we had ever owned of all ship types combined. The economic data supported this assessment. Japan's total wartime production included approximately 76,000 military aircraft of all types. America produced over 324,000 military aircraft, including nearly 40,000 carrier-based fighters and bombers. The famous Grumman F-6F Hellcat alone accounted for over 12,000 aircraft, more than Japan's entire carrier aviation program throughout the war. Perhaps most revealing were the fuel consumption statistics. By 1945, Japan's remaining carriers often remained in port, not because of battle damage, but because the nation lacked aviation gasoline for flight operations. The carrier Amagi, completed in August 1944, spent most of her brief career as a floating barracks because Japan could not fuel her aircraft. Meanwhile, American carriers consumed fuel at rates that would have exhausted Japan's entire petroleum reserves in weeks. The floating air bases that had appeared overnight in the Philippine Sea represented the full flowering of American industrial democracy applied to warfare. They were products not just of shipyards and factories, but of a political and economic system capable of mobilizing entire populations for sustained effort. Japan, despite the courage and skill of its personnel, simply lacked the industrial foundation necessary to compete in a war of production. The admirals who said, "We cannot win," after seeing America's carriers were not defeatists. They were realists who understood that modern warfare had become a contest of industrial capacity, and in that contest, Japan had been mathematically defeated from the moment it chose war with America. The story of Japanese admirals confronting America's floating air bases represents more than a single naval defeat. It marks the moment when industrial capacity became the decisive factor in modern warfare. The Essex-class carriers that crowded the horizon of the Philippine Sea were not merely weapons, but symbols of a fundamental transformation in how nations wage war. They demonstrated that in conflicts between industrial powers, victory belongs not to the most skilled or courageous warriors, but to the society capable of producing the most effective tools of war at the greatest scale. Admiral Ozawa's recognition that Japan cannot win reflected a profound understanding that transcended military tactics or strategic planning. He grasped that his nation faced not just the American Navy, but American industry itself. The assembly lines of Detroit retooled for war production, the steel mills of Pittsburgh working around the clock, the vast training facilities that could produce pilots faster than Japan could shoot them down. This was warfare transformed from a contest of arms to a competition of entire economic systems. The human tragedy of this realization extends beyond the thousands of young pilots who died in hopeless battles. It encompasses the broader failure of Japanese leadership to understand the nature of modern industrial warfare before committing their nation to a conflict it could not win. The floating air bases appeared overnight, only to those who had failed to comprehend America's industrial potential, a potential that perceptive observers like Admiral Yamamoto had recognized and warned against before Pearl Harbor. The legacy of the Philippine Sea extends into our contemporary world, where conflicts between nations increasingly become contests of technological and industrial capacity rather than traditional military valor. The lesson learned by Japanese admirals in 1944, that courage and skill cannot overcome overwhelming material disadvantage, remains relevant in an era where warfare is shaped by computer chips and satellite networks as much as by aircraft carriers and submarines. Perhaps most poignantly, the story reveals the ultimate futility of attempting to solve political problems through military force when the underlying economic realities make victory impossible. The Japanese admirals who gazed upon Task Force 58 that June morning understood, perhaps more clearly than their political leaders ever would, that their nation had chosen a war it could not win against an opponent whose strength lay not in any single weapon or strategy, but in the inexhaustible productivity of a free society mobilized for total war.